Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of the final episode of Season 3 of Star Trek Lower Decks. And it wasn't a bad episode, there are a lot of things in it which I liked, but also there were some stupid things in it. And so overall I think it was kind of disappointing for a season final. They did answer some of the mysteries which they previously set up, but the answers were not really that satisfying. They also never really explained why the Brain conquered that planet in the previous episode, the Brekka planet from TNG. At least they explained that the Admiral did know about it, and so he deliberately sent the Cerritos there so that it will get attacked, so that he can save it with his AI starships. And also revealed that he was the same guy that Rappaport saw in those flashbacks, the one who erased his memories, and that Rappaport was the one who designed the prototype of the AI ships. And it's all kind of the usual trope of the evil admiral who thinks he's doing something for the greater good but is actually creating something evil. So that was kind of a reference to all those kinds of stories in the old Star Trek shows, and as usual there are a whole lot of good references to the previous shows, and some of them are kind of funny. Like there's a scene when Jack demonstrates how to sit on a chair, and he basically does the Riker maneuver sitting on a chair from behind. So a lot of these references are kind of good and funny, but some of the attention to detail is kind of lacking a little bit. For example, they show us Starfleet Command, and it looks exactly as it did in Deep Space Nine when they showed it, and yet we see people walking in that tube next to that park. But in Deep Space Nine we saw that tube was used for some kind of a train going through it, I guess like a hyperloop. The tube, I guess, is used to create vacuum inside it so that the train can go faster inside it. So why are people walking in there in these shots? So it's as if someone looked at a photo of it but didn't actually watch that episode, so they didn't notice that there's supposed to be a train going through that tube and not just people walking in it, which doesn't make sense. If it's just used for people walking in there, why does it need to be a closed tube? So it made much more sense when it was used for some kind of transporting vehicle. Maybe it's used for both. Maybe in some periods of the day people can walk through it. Maybe the train was broken that day. I can come up with excuses for stuff like that, but it's still annoying me a little bit that they do pay good attention to detail, but not all the way. There's also a scene when starships are fighting while at warp and they're shooting phasers at each other, and that's something that we did see a few times. I think in Deep Space Nine there were some episodes when starships did fire phasers in warp. So it's not the first time someone made that mistake, but I think in TNG they were always careful never to show any ships firing phasers or any beams in warp. They only shot torpedoes, because the explanation is the torpedoes are able to stay at warp for a few minutes to reach their target, unlike phasers which should really dissipate immediately if you shoot them while you're at warp. A possible explanation for this is that it might work if you extend your warp field up until the ship that you're attacking, and that enables the phaser beam to maintain the same momentum as the ships. And so I guess we can come up with excuses, but it's still kind of bugging me a little bit that they're making those kinds of mistakes without explaining them. Still, I think this show is more respectful to the old Star Trek shows than any of the other recent productions, and so I do want to give them credit for that. For example, in the very beginning they show us that classic starbase of the jellyfish design, which is one that I personally really loved. I remember seeing it as a little kid on TNG, and I absolutely love its design. First of all, its similarity to the whole of the Enterprise D, the same kind of style, the same colors, the same kind of smooth, pretty looking design, and the jellyfish design itself is kind of cool in my opinion, and the fact that there's like a city on the very top of it is really cool, and it kind of gives you a sense of scale. It shows you how huge it is, and so I really love that design, so I loved seeing it here as well. And the Cerritos is inside of it because it's undergoing repairs because of the Breen battle in the previous episode, and they never explained why the Breen were there. Unfortunately, they only explained that the Admiral knew that they were there and he wanted to set up the Cerritos, so at least it was not a complete coincidence that he saved them in the last second and all of that. And when they show us the meeting room in Starfleet headquarters, it looks exactly like the one we saw in Star Trek 6, and so that's another good attention to detail. And the lead admiral seems really similar to the one in Star Trek Picard, the one who cursed Picard out, so maybe it's supposed to be the same one, I'm not sure. She's kind of the same type. And another small nitpick I have is that all the admirals' rank insignias seem to be on only one side of the neck, while in all the older shows they were always on both sides of it. So I'm not sure if it's a continuity mistake, or maybe we can explain it that they simply redesigned the uniform and so admirals no longer have their ranks on both sides of their necks, and so maybe it's simply a redesign. So anyway, the evil admiral wants Starfleet to decommission the entire California class and replace it with his new Texas class of the automated AI starships. And Starfleet tends to side with him, and none of this makes much sense, because even if the Cerritos did fail in their previous mission and all of that, why does that mean that every other ship of the same class is somehow guilty of that and should be decommissioned? And what would they do with all their crews? And why do it if the ships themselves are functioning? Why not keep them around as backup ships anyway? Why not have both of those classes around? Why cannot the Texas class simply join the fleet while also keeping the California class around? So it makes no sense why should one come on the expense of the other. So Starfleet decides to settle it by having a space race between the new Texas class and the Cerritos, sending them on missions to see who does it faster or better. And the evil admiral lights up a cigar, even gives them a head start because he's so overconfident that his ship is so much better. And whenever they show him talking with his AI ship, the screen looks exactly like the one from TOS, when that guy was also talking with his automated computer ship. And the crew is obviously worried that they're all going to be assigned to outposts and not on starships, and so they're doing their best. And there's a scene when Boimler does an imitation of the bridge crew, and just as he's doing the imitation of Shax, Shax comes in and sees it and runs away crying like a little girl. And that is kind of funny because of how tough he is usually, and yet he's so emotional and fragile on the inside. And then they mention Mariner and how horrible her life must be right now, and then they cut to her and she's doing Indiana Jones stuff in space, and she's collecting artifacts. And then she and her new partner discuss where the funding is for their projects, because they're donating everything they find to museums. And so Mariner asks who is funding their operation, and she doesn't want to tell her. And later in the episode she digs around in the ship's computer and finds out that it is Admiral Picard who is financing their operations. So I thought it's a nice reference as well, because Picard was always a big fan of archaeology as well, and if he wasn't in Starfleet he'd be doing that kind of thing as well. And it might be a clue to what I theorized earlier, that maybe this woman is the secret daughter of Vash and Picard, and maybe that's why Picard is now financing her and giving her all the resources and all of that. So that might be a nice reference. Maybe they'll do that later on. So anyway, the Cerritos is competing with the new Texas class and going to all kinds of planets to help them out, to set up all kinds of power plants and stuff. And yet the new ship, the AI ship, is able to immediately transport whole buildings down to the planet right away without having to construct them. I guess maybe it has that automatic construction thing that we saw in Star Trek Prodigy, of being able to replicate and build things in the ship right away, and maybe to beam them down to the planet right away, completely constructed. And so if that's possible, why not simply give that same kind of technology to all Starfleet ships? What's the point of competing ship to ship if that ship is simply superior technologically wise? So it doesn't really make much sense, as I said. So they're jumping from planet to planet trying to outrun the other ship and failing, and they arrive at some planet which is totally barren, and it looks kind of similar to the planet from the Alien movie. It even has a similar name, like LV and the number or something really similar. So I wonder if it's a coincidence. Probably not. Probably it's a reference. So anyway, they need to set up some kind of terraforming equipment there or something, and then Tandy discovers there's microscopic life forms there, and they have to stop everything to check if those microbes might be sentient or something first, which I think is also a reference to Star Trek 2, when they were not allowed to do experiments on a planet even if it had microscopic life forms, because it might evolve to something later. And yet here they say it's only if it's sentient already that they're not allowed to do it. So anyway, because of this delay, the other ship wins the race basically, but it totally ignored the Prime Directive, which will come up later. And the final planet they need to get to is one which periodically shifts into another dimension and comes back only once in a while to our universe, and that was a reference to the Deep Space Nine episode Meridian, which had that kind of planet, but it was in the Gamma Quadrant, so maybe that's why they didn't make it the exact same planet. But they said it's one of those planets that does that, which is kind of funny to know that it's something that is not really that unique as we thought in Deep Space Nine. Even the special effects of how it phases into our universe looks exactly the same like in that Deep Space Nine episode. And yet it's not the same planet, the people on it look totally different. And one of them kind of shouts at the sky for Starfleet to hear, and he's expecting to see them in the sky, and his mother tells him, you're not going to see them when they're in orbit, at most you'll see a little dot. And I think that was a reference to that stupid scene in Star Trek Discovery when Book just looks up at the sky and sees and recognizes his ship, even though it's in high orbit. When we see it from space, it's in a very big distance from the planet, and his ship is really small and tiny, and yet when he looks up from the planet, he recognizes his own ship in the sky. And I said in my reviews of Discovery, that was probably the stupidest moment in the entire show, and maybe in the entire franchise, that Book just looks up and says, oh, that's my ship. Even though when we see it from space, it was in high orbit of the planet, and yet he recognizes it. So maybe it was a poke at that. And at some point, Rappaport studies the AI code of that other ship, and he sees that it's familiar to him, and then he has a flashback remembering that he's the one who designed it, and it's the same code that he used to make Budgie, the evil AI holodeck helper, which became evil and all of that. So that was the first clue that it's all going to end badly. And the evil ship does end up winning the race, but then Tandy asks how come the other ship didn't slow down for the Prime Directive reasons when they found those microbes, how come the other ship totally ignored it. And that was the first clue that ship is going to turn evil, which was kind of obvious anyway, but it's nice that they're kind of setting it up, and they're kind of tying up all the previous loose ends of what they previously set up, with Rappaport being kind of having a different personality in the past and designing ships, and someone erased his memory for some reason and all of that. So they do finally explain all of that by saying it was the evil admiral who stole his designs for that ship and then erased his memory. And also realize the other ship is totally ignoring the Prime Directive, which is a problem, so they want to confront the Admiral about all of that. And then the Admiral orders his ship to destroy the Cerritos, and he gives it full autonomous control of itself, and then the ship becomes evil basically, and then the first thing it does is to kill its father, that Admiral, and it blows him up with a phaser beam, which was kind of funny and cool, and it starts attacking the starbase, and it activates all the other ships of the same design who are in the starbase, and they all come out and start attacking the base. And then Mariner sees all of that in the Federation News Service. And so this was all on the news, and yet for some reason Starfleet didn't immediately call for backup to help that starbase. They didn't send their fleet to help out, even though it was in the Federation News, and it had to be Mariner who calls up the other ships to help in the end. So that point didn't make any sense, and that's something that really annoys me about this episode, that too many things don't really make much sense if you think about them. So why did they need Mariner to go around calling other ships to help out if it was all on the Federation News Service? And so if it was on the news, Starfleet would have known about it anyway. And how come only the California class ships showed up in the end to help out? Why not all of Starfleet? Why did Mariner only call the California class ships? So it doesn't really make much sense. It was nice that we saw all the crews of those ships that we saw previously in previous episodes whenever they would encounter another ship like that, and we got to know the crews of those ships as well, and so it was nice to see them. But why did only California class ships showed up to help? Is Starfleet so segregated now they're only helping out ships of the same class as their own? And so none of this makes much sense. And it's also a little bit annoying how Mariner had to show up to help, and without her, they would all be doomed and all of that. So that really gave me kind of Discovery vibes as well, because just like in Discovery, where it's Michael Burnham who always has to show up to save the day, without her, the entire universe would be doomed and all of that, even though the context of it all doesn't make any sense. It's just because the show wants her to be heroic so much. And so it's kind of the same thing here. Here it's all much more forgivable because it's kind of a comedy show, so all the silly things, all the tropes, all the usual things like that, we can view them as a parody of the same kind of things from the other shows, and so that's why I am more forgiving toward it, but it's still kind of stupid. I would have preferred it to be smarter and to make sense, and not for it all to be so convenient. It's always in the very last second, just as the Cerritos is about to be hit by those purple torpedoes that evil AI is shooting. And I did like how those torpedoes split into multiple torpedoes. That's the same kind of effect as in the early TNG, when the photon torpedoes would always spread out to multiple ones before hitting the target, and that's something they kind of stopped doing after a while. Maybe they decided it didn't really look that cool, or it didn't make sense, and at some point they stopped doing that, but it was kind of nice to see that again with these new purple torpedoes. And also Shax keeps suggesting ejecting the warp core, and everyone ignores him because that's what he always suggests. And that reminds me of kind of the Worf problem from TNG, because in that show often Worf would suggest something that would have actually saved the day if they did it, and yet they always ignored his advice because he was always the most aggressive right away and all of that, and they always ignored him. So I thought it was a funny reference to that. And yet in this situation, when they're trying to run away from those AI ships at warp, that actually does make sense. They want to eject the warp core and make it explode on those other ships. And so Shax is finally given the opportunity to do it, what he always suggested. They finally let him do it, and he's really happy. So that was kind of funny. One small issue I have with that scene is that they said that they will drop out of warp immediately if they eject the warp core. And that once again kind of contradicts something from TNG, because in the TNG episode Brothers, they said that even if they separate the saucer section from the drive section, the saucer will stay at warp for 2 minutes before dropping out, and so that suggests that you do maintain momentum even without a functioning warp drive, which maybe kind of explains why you're able to fire torpedoes or even phasers while at warp. Maybe you stay at warp even without a warp engine for a while. And so how come they drop out of warp immediately after they eject the warp core, and yet the warp core itself does stay at warp after being ejected, even though it doesn't have its own engine? And so little details like that don't really make much sense. Maybe we can explain it by saying that you do stay at warp for a while, but they deliberately went out of it. They kind of flew to the side and maybe put on the brakes deliberately to get out of the way. So we can explain it. I do wish the dialogue would have explained it a little bit better. That would have been more clever. I would have appreciated it more if they had their technobubble done better. I personally would have appreciated it more. And also, before they detonated the warp drive, they also suggested other things from previous Star Trek shows, like one of the ensigns says maybe we can modify the deflector dish to use it as a giant weapon, and the captain asked maybe she can confuse the evil AI by putting it into a logical loophole or something, like what Kirk used to do in TOS when he always would confuse the computers with paradoxes. But then Rappaport says that no, he designed that AI to resist paradoxes, and so those were all really funny references to the previous shows. And then eventually they ejected the warp core and made it blow up the other ships. But then one of the evil ships did survive, and there is attacking the Cerritos. And then all those other California class ships show up because Mariner was the one who phoned them, basically. So how come Starfleet didn't phone them? It was all over the Federation news, and yet Starfleet never thought about sending ships to help. And only the California class ships arrived, because now ships of Starfleet only help each other out if they're from the same class. Otherwise they wouldn't show up. There was one Sovereign class ship that did show up earlier, and that was really nice visually. And again, visually I love this show. I love the fact that everything looks exactly like in the old shows that I loved. So I do love it visually. I just wish it would make a little bit more sense in the bigger picture as well. There was also a nice shot of the starbase getting its weapons out, and it looked kind of similar to those Deep Space Nine weapon torrents that we saw in those episodes when Deep Space Nine was fighting fleets of ships. So that was also a nice reference. It's kind of surprising how such a huge starbase has so little weapons, that 3 little ships can overpower it. So maybe they should have simply had more ships of that class show up, and then it would be more of a fair fight. And also that final space battle when all the California ships show up and start shooting the one evil ship, it just seemed kind of anticlimactic because of how easy it was, because it was so many against one. And so I wish it would have been done kind of more epic, maybe have more of those evil AI ships and not just 3 of them and just one in the end. So it wasn't really that impressive. So there is some good attention to detail, there is some sense of epicness about all of it, just that some of it was kind of a little bit stupid. I wish it would have been written differently. And after they destroy that evil ship, they are back at the starbase being repaired again, and a new warp core has been installed, and Mariner comes back to the ship. There's an interesting shot when that Andorian girlfriend of hers looks kind of worried, maybe because she knows that she didn't believe her when everyone accused her of sabotaging the ship with that talking with that reporter. And the rest of the crew are really happy to see her, and she's reinstated in Starfleet. And we also have a new member of the crew joining. That was the same Vulcan ensign that we previously saw on the Vulcan ship, the one who was too overly emotional compared to the other Vulcans. And I remember hoping that she's going to join the crew as a regular, because I really liked her character. She was really funny, in my opinion. The way that she's still kind of like a Vulcan to us, but kind of too much like a human to the other Vulcans, that she's somewhere in the middle. So I thought She was really well done in that episode she appeared in, so we see that she's now joining the Cerritos, and so that's great because I really liked her character. And that's basically it. There was also an after credit scene when we see someone picking up Rappaport's old implant, the one that was ripped out from his eye in the end of season 1, and we see it floating in space in the same debris field as we previously saw Peanut Hamper at, and someone is tractoring it to some ship. It's kind of a green tractor beam, so maybe it's a Romulan or a Klingon ship, I don't know yet. We see that Beji is still inside that implant, and so it's kind of an evil cliffhanger. What they poked fun at previously in some previous episode, they said you shouldn't end it on an evil cliffhanger, and yet they kind of do it, but only in the post-credit scene. So that was kind of funny. I don't know if they'll do something with it later. I guess they probably will. Maybe they'll put Beji into that same room with all those evil computers in the end, and maybe all those other evil AIs will escape at some point. Maybe they'll all collaborate together to form one giant evil AI and do something together. So I guess we'll wait and see. So overall, it wasn't a bad episode. I enjoyed it. A lot of really good references, a lot of funny moments, but also some stupid moments as well. So that's why I can't really give it a really high score. I would say this was a 7 out of 10 episode in my opinion. It wasn't bad, but it could have been better. So let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.